Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, the Australian people know that this is a government completely out of touch with the needs of working Australians and pensioners. They know how heartless this government is. They know how this government completely misunderstands the impact of their own decisions. They know that this Treasurer completely misunderstands his own policies and the impact it has on the Australian people. They know that this Treasurer puts together policies which impact on them, and then he doesn't understand the impact of his own actions. They know all this because the Treasurer has told them. They know all this because the Treasurer has laid bare his lack of understanding of the impact of his own decisions, because he told them that poor people don't drive cars, because he told them that if poor people have cars, well, they don't drive them very far. He told them, Madam Speaker, that the GP tax doesn't apply to people with a chronic illness. He told them, Madam Speaker, that the GP tax was only the cost of a couple of middies. What an insult to the Australian people. What an insult to the Australian people this Treasurer and this Prime Minister and this entire government are. The Australian people know how heartless they are, they know how out of touch they are, they know how they do not understand the impact of their own policies. But they say, the Australian people, to this government, at least be competent as you go about your program of cuts to them. But what we get from this government is cuts and chaos all at the same time. The alibis change, the narrative changes, everything changes except, Madam Speaker, the cuts. We get the changing stories over the course of one interview or one day or 1 week. We get the changing alibis and excuses for their actions, but at its heart, the government's strategy remains the same. Make those who can least afford it pay the cost for their policies. The prejudice remains the same and the result remains the same. We've seen it over the last day or so, Madam Speaker. Remember, we're told how dire everything is, because that pesky Senate won't rubber stamp their broken promises. We're told regularly how bad things are, how we're heading towards cataclysm for our economy, and, of course, then we're told something different. We were told today, Madam Speaker, by the Prime Minister, well, we've made a lot more progress than people think. We're told, actually, things are all right, because the intergenerational report apparently tells us that with everything that's been passed, we get back to balance in just 5 years. Oh, that's okay. Then the intergenerational report says it. No problem, Madam Speaker, we're told now. Nothing to see here. Move along, says the Prime Minister. Move along. The fact that there's 40 years of deficits after that, oh, well, no, don't worry about that, Madam Speaker. We wouldn't worry about that, because everything's fine now. No wonder the Australian people are confused by this government's economic narrative, because they confuse themselves. We've got former Treasurer Costello who says, well, there's mixed messages here from the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, but Peter Costello can't work it out. No wonder the Australian people say this government's not up to it. This Treasurer in particular is simply not up to it, not up to the task before him, not up to the task entrusted to him by the Australian people, incompetent as he goes about his chosen project of cutting from the Australian people and from the Australian families. We had the Prime Minister today say, don't worry about it, we're back at balance within 5 years. Of course, when the Treasurer is asked, when will we be back to balance or when will we be back to surplus, he says, oh, I'm not putting a date on it. Well, I couldn't possibly put a date on it. Now, again, we have dysfunction between the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. The one thing, though, to give the government credit that is always consistent is their attack on low and middle income earners. That's the one thing that never changes when it comes to this government. Everything else changes, the stories change, the alibis change, the excuses change, the blame game changes, but the answer's always the same. Those who least can afford it will pay, says the Treasurer. That's what he says. That's his one consistent narrative. He says to the Australian people, to Australian working families and pensioners, you will pay. Now, I want to spend a minute, Madam Speaker, talking in particular about the pensioners of Australia. We had the Treasurer at the dispatch box yesterday telling us how much he respects taxpayers. I respect taxpayers, he said. Well, how about a bit of respect for Australia's pensioners? People who work hard all their life, Madam Speaker. How about not telling Australia's pensioners that they are leaners, because they, Madam Speaker, are not leaners. And the Treasurer's own report, written by the Treasurer himself, his report tells us something very interesting about Australia's Treasurer. Remember how many times we've been told by the Treasurer the Australian age pension system is unsustainable. He makes himself out the hero. I'm making the pension sustainable by cutting it, he tells us. But what does this report actually tell us about the age pension? Well, we all know that this report contains 3 scenarios. This highly political document contains 3 scenarios. And one of those scenarios is previous policy. And in this point, Madam Speaker, while this is a complete dodge by the government, previous policy, I am proud to say that the previous policy included in this report is the previous policy of the Labor government of fair indexation for the age pension. Fair indexation for Australia's pensioners who worked hard all their life. And this report tells us how much that policy will cost, how much fair indexation of the age pension will cost over coming years. And it tells us it will cost 3.6% of GDP by 2054-55. 3.6% of Australia's GDP. I say Australia's pensioners are worth that, Madam Speaker. I say that it is fair when the OECD average cost for all pension systems is 7.8%. I think Australia can afford 3.6%. I think Australia's pensioners have worked hard all their life, they have lifted all their life, and they deserve that support. We in office commissioned, Madam Speaker, a review, and that review found that CPI, that inflation, was a woefully inadequate indexation measure for the age pension. So we said no. We will have 3 measures to improve the age pension. One will be average weekly earnings, one will be the CPI, and one will be a basket of goods which pensioners primarily buy. That is fair. And we saw the Prime Minister in a shameful performance in the House earlier this week say, under your system, under the Labor Party system, Australia's pensioners would be worse off. That was blatantly untrue, Madam Speaker. It was clearly and undeniably untrue, because the pension goes up by the highest of those 3 measures under our policy, a policy we will defend in this House and that House across the country, because it is a fair one. Madam Speaker, 40 years ago, a Prime Minister, who we recently mourned, said to the Australian people, as Australia grows and prospers, Australia's pensioners should share in that prosperity. And he introduced a link to average weekly earnings for males. He said, as Australians earn more, pensioners should earn more. And he indicated new government policy to link the pension to weekly earnings of 25%. Now, before we hear from members opposite that this was unsustainable and unaffordable and typical Whitlam spending, let us remember that that policy was continued by his successors. Malcolm Fraser, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, John Howard, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard all continued that policy. And in fact, the previous Labor government said we can do it better. We can do better than 25%. We can lift that to 27%, because Australia's pensioners deserve it. All this remained bipartisan policy for 40 years, until this Prime Minister and this Treasurer, without a skerrick of a mandate, said to Australia's pensioners, you do not deserve that. You do not deserve to share in Australia's prosperity. You do not deserve to share in Australia's wage growth. We will institute a policy which will see your pension fall to 16%. 16% of average weekly earnings. Well, that is shameful, Madam Speaker. It is shameful that without a skerrick of honesty, without a word of a mandate, without one indication to the Australian people that this would be the case, they implement the policy. They tell us what the policy is 8 months after the election. How dare this Treasurer lecture others about when they should release policies, when he released his policies 8 months after the last federal election, when he stood there and delivered the federal budget. Well, there are facts, Madam Speaker. Australia has the second lowest spending on age pension as a percentage of the economy in the OECD. And we have the second highest level of poverty for people over 65 in the developed world. Now, we said in office, Madam Speaker, that we can do better. That's why we increased the age pension and we improved the indexation. And it's also why we made it easier for Australians to save for their own retirement through superannuation, why we increased the superannuation guarantee to 12%, and why we gave low-income earners a fair tax concession, which this government has abolished, which this government is proud of abolishing. On Monday night, the Treasurer said, I'm always cautious when taking money off people. Well, no, he is not. No, he is not. Not when they're low-income earners. Not when they are people who've worked hard all their life. He calls them leaners, Madam Speaker, but they are not. They have been hard workers, and they deserve this parliament to defend them. They deserve this parliament to stand up for them. Well, only half this parliament does, Madam Speaker, and they all sit on this side of the chamber. We will defend pensioners in opposition and we'll defend and improve them in government as well.